Caliphate, then the Ottoman Empire, before that other, Middle Eastern Muslim kingdoms, because Islam, being a religion that came after Judaism and Christianity, respected Judaism and Christianity as the people of the book, and accepted their rights to practice their religion. Those were the religions that existed in the Middle East. Actually, in the Quran, when you look at the Quran, you see that Jews, Christians, and another sect, a religion called the Sabians, which actually has led to a lot of discussions. Who are these Sabians? The Quran is speaking about. But apparently it was a somewhat monotheistic religion in the Middle East at the time. They are respected. And actually, a verse says, the people who believe and do good deeds within those religions will be saved too. That's a verse that disturbs some of our Islamic scholars, and they try to find ways to claim, no, only Muslims will be saved. Everybody else will go to hell. But actually, if you read the verse, it doesn't exactly say that. But that's about salvation, and afterlife. That's not our topic. The thing is, because of that acceptance of these other religions, actually Muslim states accepted that Jews and Christians and Sabians could exist. And when Muslims actually came to this side of the world, first conquering India and the subcontinent, and ultimately came to Malaysia, Muslims realized that there are other traditions here, like Hinduism and Buddhism, and they have accepted that they are people of the book, of sorts as well. So they have given the right to practice their religion. So in that sense, we can say that in Islamic tradition, we do have a notion of pluralism. Churches and mosques and synagogues coexisted, in Ottoman Empire, in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Istanbul, or elsewhere. However, there was one aspect of that pluralism. It was a hierarchical pluralism. What do I mean by hierarchical? Muslims were the ruling nation, and the others were the ruled nations. In other words, the bureaucracy was only for Muslims. Muslims could govern. Muslims had more legal advantages. Christians and Jews had to pay an extra tax called jizya. And in that sense, this was pluralism, which was not based on equality. It was based on hierarchy. Now the question is this the universal Islamic model? Is this how we should think of modern states? Muslims should be the dominant group, and non-Muslims should be the subservient groups. A lot of people think like that, and I would say we don't have to think like that, because we can also find a different model, again within Islam, based on not hierarchy, but equality. And where do we find that model? Right in the practice of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. There is this famous document called the Medina Constitution. Let me explain. When Prophet Muhammad was persecuted in Mecca with other fellow Muslims by the polytheists, he had to, in the 13th year of the revelation, the first revelation, he fled from Mecca to Medina. And when he went to Medina, he found a group of Muslims already who believed in him and waiting for him, and they created the Muslim community, the first Muslim autonomous community there. And in Medina, though, there were other people. There were Jews. And Prophet Muhammad signed a deal with the Jews of Medina. We know this from this document called the Medina Constitution or Medina Charter, written about by a lot of prominent Muslim scholars in the past couple of decades. When you look at this charter, you see something very interesting. Accordingly, Prophet Muhammad becomes a head of state in Medina, but Jews and Muslims have equal rights. They are defined as an ummah. The word ummah, what do we use ummah for today? For Muslims, right? The nation of Muslims. Well, according to the Constitution of Medina, Jews and Muslims were the Ummah of Medina, the nation of Medina. So the nation of Medina was not just Muslims, it was Muslims and Jews with equal rights. To Muslims, their religion, to Jews, their religion. Now, we can also think today, if there were not Jews, but also Christians, Buddhists, Hindus, maybe atheists in Medina, what would be the case? Perhaps they would be included in the Constitution as communities with equal rights. So this was another Islamic model. And what became the model is what I described as the hierarchical model. But I think, and a lot of people argue that way, for example, Illiberal in Turkey, a very prominent Islamic scholar, he argues the hierarchical model was just based on the idea of conquest. You conquer someplace and you are the dominant group and you create a political system. But it was not the necessarily Islamic ideal. And another thing, the hierarchical model was abandoned in the 19th century by, guess whom? The Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which was the seat of the caliphate until 1924, had a modernization period in the 19th century that we call the Tanzimat, the reorganization, also called the reform period. Tanzimat began in 1839 with a famous edict of the Sultan, which said that the empire lost its former glory, and to reestablish its strength and justice and so on and so forth, the empire needs reforms. And some of these reforms included strengthening rule of law. For example, before Tanzimat, the Sultan could say, behead this man. So just, so the Sultan could give a verdict. Now, according to the Tanzimat, nobody could be given a punishment before a trial in a court. So the Sultan's powers were limited. This was one thing. And this was an import from the West of sorts, but some Islamic defenders of Tanzimat said, this is also a return back to our original Sharia principles. The executive couldn't have the right to punish people without a trial. That's an actually Islamic principle too. But, Sultan dominated for a lot of centuries. So something coming from the West can actually have some roots within our own tradition as well. We should not, in that sense, it should not be trashed out. But anyway, in Tanzimat era, one thing that happened was the actually putting an end to this system of hierarchy and making Jews and Christians of the Ottoman Empire equal citizens. Equality, which was then called musawat, from the Arabic language, equality, Ottomans. But in the Ottoman Empire, it was a big discussion, the musawat, the equality discussion. This began with Tanzimat. It had another step in the Islahat Edict in 1856. Then in the Ottoman Constitution of 1876, full equality of all citizens were announced. The Ottoman Constitution read, all citizens of the empire are called Osmanlı, which means Ottoman, regardless of their race or creed, and they are equal. In practice, this meant that Armenians, Jews, or Christians could enter Ottoman bureaucracy. That's why in late Ottoman Empire you have a lot of people from Armenian or Jewish descent and who are practicing Jews and Armenians, who are pashas, who are ministers, today's term, who are the Ottoman Parliament, which was an elected parliament, which convened in 1876 with the same year with the Constitution, had a lot of, 1/3 of the Ottoman Parliament was non-Muslim Jews and Christians. And Ottoman scholars such as Ahmet Cevdet Pasha justified these reforms, saying that the political, social aspects of Islam are open to change and reinterpretation. And state has the right to bring these new visions. And musawat was not, equality was not incompatible with the Islamic notions. Well, why was the Ottoman Empire was doing this? There was a political reason. The Ottoman Empire was trying to win the hearts and minds of Christians who were trying to get independent. So there was a push for this. And we should see that. And also there was some Western encouragement of these reforms. Yet we should see that the very seat of the caliphate brought the idea of equal citizenship right in the middle of the 19th century. Today, I'm therefore sometimes sad to see that in the Middle East, some Islamic movements oppose equality in the 21st century, disregarding, what the caliphate did like 2 centuries ago. Now, these are some historical facts I think we can think about today, but we also should face another question, and the question is, why should we do that? Why should we accept the equality of all different people with us? Why should we allow heretical communities, to flourish? What if we allow the Ahmadiyya or the Shia and so on and so forth? Aren't they heretics? Aren't they wrong groups and so on and so forth? Now, this is a very important question, and I think to face this question, we have to look at our own way of thinking. The person who says that these are heretics and they should not have the same rights, I would ask to that person, how would you make this argument if you were in a Shia majority country, which was 90% Shia, and you're 10% Sunni, and you're the heretic? How would you defend yourself? How would you defend your rights? If your principle is whomever is the majority must dominate and oppress the minority, how are you going to defend yourself when you're the minority, which you are in some cases? If the principle is power rules and whoever majority has the right to be the dominant group, how are you going to move with that? How are you going to defend Muslim minorities? How are you going to stand up to Donald Trump? They say he says this is a Christian country and we should kick Muslims out. There are illiberal people in the West too, trust me, a lot. I think we should have a principle. The principle should be people should have basic securities and rights, whomever they are, whatever they are. And that's one thing. The other thing is that actually, how do we have the right to define other Muslims as deviants? I'm Sunni, and from the Hanafi tradition, let's say, a reformed, let's say, progressive Hanafi perspective, because I think this is more accurate, But if I see a Shia, how can I say you're a heretic? How do I have that authority? I'll go to afterlife and learn what God thinks about my deeds. And he will go to afterlife and he will see what God thinks about his deeds, his beliefs. How can I have the judgment? Supposedly I'm bringing myself to the level of divine judgment and say, you're a heretic, you should be punished for that. Can we actually define other Muslims as deviants and oppress them? This was actually an important question in early Islam. This began with the famous battle between supporters of Ali and Muawiyah, the first fitna, the civil war in Islam. In the Battle of Siffin, and it was a larger conflict, it went on with Karbala and so on and so forth, the first battle. And in the face of this battle, we have the first terrorists of the Muslim world. Who were they? The Khawarij, at least some part of the Khawarij, the dissenters. These people were the fanatics. They said both Ali and Muawiyah and their supporters have become infidels. They're kafirs. And when they declared them infidels, they don't just criticize them, they started killing them. It was the ISIS ideology of the 7th century, if you will, early 8th century. So these were the fanatics of Islam. I'm not following their way. There was an alternative view to this, defended by the group called Murji'a. Are you familiar with the Murji'a? Have you ever heard? ISIS wrote a long article saying Murji'a is the greatest fitna, a year ago in their magazine, Dabik, and I wrote about that later. The Murji'a were the people who said, wait a minute, how can we say Muawiyah or Ali are infidels. We can't know that. God can only judge people in that sense. So let's postpone this discussion to afterlife, to be solved by God. They were called Murjia because of this postponing idea. Murjia comes from irja, which means postponing. They were the postponers. So I think we should postpone to afterlife our discussions about who's the right Muslim and which sect of Islam is the right one. We should follow the sect of Islam that we believe to be the right one. Of course, we have the right to do that. If there are other Muslims with different persuasions, we should say, well, I think my faith, my interpretation of faith is better, but if you follow that, I can respect you and God will tell us what is right at the end. We can't play God to denounce that person. So I think the Murjia approach was the right approach. And let me tell you one more thing to how it connects to liberalism and these deviant Western ideas. You know, when I read the Murjia argument many years ago and I said, wow, here's an amazing source in Islamic thought for pluralism and liberalism. You know who made the exact same argument with Murjia 1,000 years later? John Locke, the father of modern classical liberalism. When you read John Locke's famous letter concerning toleration, John Locke in the 17th century in England, they had the exact same debates. Should we suppress these heretics called Catholics and Puritans? You know, the Anglicans were discussing these. The Anglicans were the dominant force and they were the heretics. John Locke said, no, we should not suppress them. And he said, because if we suppress them, we give ourselves the authority that only belongs to God. He said we should accept that only the Almighty can judge different churches. So in England, these churches should coexist and we should not suppress them. So in both religious traditions, you have liberal sources. You have illiberal sources too, like the Khawarij, like the ISIS of today, or like the Christians who tortured and burned people for being heretics. Christians were not liberal for a very, very long time. Only, with some rethinking. Like people like through John Locke, who were not anti-Christian, who were just Christians who are looking at their fate from a more liberal perspective. Change came. I think we are living in the 17th century England context in some Muslim countries today. It was former Turkish President Abdullah Gül who said, we are going through the 30 Years' War in Syria and Iraq, where Catholics and Protestants were killing each other. The way out is to be true to our faith, but looking at it not through dogmatic, fanatic, and arrogant ways, but looking at it in more modest, tolerant, and more, I think, pluralist ways. Thank you so much for your attention.